Hello, darling. Tonight, we wander into one of Edgar Allan Poe's most unsettling and hypnotic tales. A story where beauty, obsession, and the fragile edges of the human mind begin to blur. In a quiet, shadowed estate, a man named Igras finds his thoughts drifting, not just toward love nor memory, but towards something far stranger, something he cannot look away from. And at the center of all of it is Berenice, once vibrant, radiant, and now slowly fading into something pale, distant, almost ghost-like. But obsession has a way of sharpening the senses, of turning the smallest details into irresistible fascinations. So settle in, darling. Let the candlelight flicker, let the quiet deepen, and follow me into Poe's haunting tale, Berenice. Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues are as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, how is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness, from the covenant of peace, a simile of sorrow? But, as in ethics, evil is a consequence of good. So in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which are have their origin in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Aegeus. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy, gray, hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking peculiarities of the character of the family mansion, and the frescoes of the chief saloon, and the tapestries of the dormitories, and the chiseling of some bitterness in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very peculiar nature of the library's contents, there is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollection of the earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with it volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother, herein was I born, but it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul had not previous existence. You deny it? Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial forms, a spiritual and meaning eyes, of sound, musical yet sad, remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow too, in the possibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber was I born, thus awakening from the long night of what seemed not, but was not, noemity, at once into the very region of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild dominions of Masonic thought and education. It is not singular that I gazed upon me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away in my boyhood in books, and dissipated my youth in revere. But it is singular that as years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful that stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place in the character of my commonest thought. The realities of the world affected me in visions, and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dreams became, in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in a very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls, yet differently we grew. I ill of health and buried in gloom, she agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy, hers the ramble and the hillside, mine the studies of the cloister. I, living within my own heart and addicted, body and soul, to the most intense and painful meditation. She, roaming carelessly through life with no thought of the shadows in her path, or the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice. I call upon her name, Berenice, and from the gray ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections had started at the sound. I have vividly in her image before me now, as in the early days of her light-heartedness and joy, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty, of Sith amid the shrubberies of Arnheim, oh, naiad among its fountains. And then, all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, fatal disease, fell like the Simone upon her frame. And even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner of most subtle and terrible, disturbing even in the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where is she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primarily one which effected a revolution of so horrible a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as most distressing and obstinate in its nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminated in a trance itself, trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was in most instances startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease, then grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomanic character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must so term it, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear, indeed, that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the merely general reader an adequate idea of that nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation, not to speak technically, busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary object of the universe. To muse for long unwearied hours, with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the typography of a book, to become absorbed, for the better part of a summer's day, in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the floor, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion for physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately persevered. And such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by a condition of the mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet, let me not be misapprehended. The undue earnest and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature, frivolous, must not be confounded in the character with that ruminating prosperity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in the persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might be at first supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of such prosperity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object, usually not frivolously, imperceptibly loses sight of this object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions, issuing therefrom until the conclusion of a daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the indictment or first cause of his musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming that through the medium of any distempered vision a refracted and unreal importance. Few deductions in any were made, and those few perniciously returning in upon the original object as a center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was the prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind, more particularly exercised, were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are, with the daydreamer, the speculative. My book at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to irritate the disorder, partook, it will be perceived largely, in their imaginative and unconsequential nature, of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I will remember, among others, the treatise of the noble Italian Calesius Secundus Curio, Dioptolidine, Bedi, Recani, Dii, St. Austin's great work, The City of God, and Tertullian's De Carne Christi, in which the paradoxical sentence, Mortimus est dele filis, credible est quae intimum est, et septimus resurrectix ceratum est quae impossibly est, occupied my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigation. Thus, it will appear that, shaken from its imbalance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken by the Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attacks of human violence and the fiercer fury of the waters and the winds, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel, and although, to a careless thinker, It might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady and the moral condition of Berenice, which afford me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation, whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining. Yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently the bitterness upon the wonder which meant and means by which no strange revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But those reflections partook not of the idiosyncrasies of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to the ordinary masses of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revealed in the less important but more startling chances and changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, on the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most assuredly I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the gray and the early morning, among the trellised shadows of the forest of noonday, and in the silence and science of the library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as a living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as a being of the earth, earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being, not as a thing to admire, but to analyze, not as the object of love, but as the theme of the more abstruse, little sultry speculation. And now I shuddered in her presence, and grew pale at her approach, yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition. I called to mind that she had loved me long ago, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when, upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days, which are the nurse of the beautiful Heiligen, I sat as I thought alone in the inner apartment of the library. But uplifting my eyes, I saw that Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the gray draperies which fell upon her figure, that caused in it so vacillating and indistinct an outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for words, could I have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked at any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon her face. The forehead was high, the very pale and singularly placid, and the once jetty hair fell partially over it, and now of a vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly of their fantastic character with the reigning melancholy of the countenance. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless and seemingly pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to their contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of a peculiar meaning, The teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never beheld them, or that having done so I had died. The shutting of a door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber, but from the disordered chamber of my brain had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away, the white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth, not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, but what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand in upon my memory. I saw them now, even more unequivocally than I beheld them before. The teeth, they were here and there and everywhere, and visibly had palpably been before me. Long, narrow, and excessively white, with the pale lips writhing upon them, as in the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strange and irresistible influence. And the multitude of objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of the mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every altitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelled upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration of their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them, and unassisted by the lips, capability of moral expression. Of Mademoiselle Sally, it has been said well, que toi ces pas Etienne des sentiments, and of Berenice, I more seriously believed que toi des dents Etienne des ides. Ah, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me, des ides. Ah, therefore it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone either restore me to peace and giving me back their reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came and tarried and went, and the day again dawned, and the mists of a second night were now gathering around, and still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasm of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as with the most vivid, hideous distinctness it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry of horror and dismay, and thereunto, after a pause, succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat, and throwing upon one of the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maid, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had seized with epilepsy, and in the early mornings, and now at the closing as of the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for the burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again, sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and exciting dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension, yet its memory was replete with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim and hideous and unintelligible recollections. I tried to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a depleted sound, the shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself that question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character, and I had seen it frequently before, for it was a property of the family physician. But how come it came upon my table? And why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence underscored therein. The words were the singular but simple ones of the poet Ibn Zayed. Despante mihi solas si cetrulin amicae vistaram, curas meas eloquentilem for levatas. Why then, as I pursued them, did the hair of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood of my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light tap on the library door, and pale as a tenant of a tomb, menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentence I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of a household, of a search in the direction of the sound. And then his tone grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered to me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to garments that were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded to the table and grasped the box that lay upon it. But I could not force it open, and in my tremor, it slipped out of my hands and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it was a rattling sound. There rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, and ivory-looking substances that were scattered to and fro about the floor. And so the darkness closes around the tale of Berenice, leaving behind the lingering echo of obsession and the fragile boundary between reason and madness. Poe had a remarkable gift for exploring the places in the mind where fascination becomes something far more dangerous. If you enjoyed wandering through this shadowed story with me tonight, Darling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey into the strange and the beautiful corners of Gothic literature. There are many more tales waiting in the candlelight. For now, let the quiet return, let the shadows soften, and sleep soundly, darling, if you can.